on the essentials of Shafi'i law, Imam Hadrami's Safinat al-Naja, in which we endeavor to cover worship or ibadat from a Shafi'i primer, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And with that we commence, as we had before, inshaAllah ta'ala, with our specific course objectives and lesson outcomes. This lesson covers leading and following in prayer, the conditions and intentions for the Imam and the follower, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Our course outcomes, as previously, is to have an introduction to Islamic law, the first step into the legacy of the Shafi'i school. It is to learn the 5 pillars of Islam at a beginner level, bi'idhnillah. In this lesson, we look specifically at the Imam's intention, the conditions for following an Imam, and the forms of following the Imam, insha'Allah. So to commence, قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا الله بعلومه وعلومكم آمين. فصل فيما تلزم فيه نية الإمامة. This segment deals specifically with when is it required for the Imam to have the intention of the Imam. Bearing in mind that in the Shafi'i school, if one follows a person, that person does not specifically need to specify the intention of being an Imam, except in these instances. So you can validly follow someone, and even if they are unaware of the fact that you are following them, it would be fine because they don't need to have the intention of being an Imam. However, in these circumstances, they need to have that intention because, simply put, the salah would not be valid if there is no jama'ah. And as a result, for the Imam's salah to be valid, he needs to intend to be the Imam so that he can acquire jama'ah, so that that salah can be valid, insha'Allah. So what does it say? It says, الَّذِي يَلْزَمُ فِيهِ نِيَّةُ الْإِمَامَةِ, that which requires the intention of being the Imam. أَرْبَعٌ, there are 4 prayers. Al-Jumu'atu, there is the Friday congregational prayer. Wal-Mu'adatu, as well as to repeat the Fard or Nafil Salah in its time, hoping for reward, which we'll cover as well, insha'Allah. Wal-Mandhuratu, a vowed prayer, but specifically vowed jama'atan, to be done in congregation. So in other words, the person made a vow that they would make a specific salah or a number of salahs, but they would do so in congregation. So therefore, congregation is required. Then moving on from that, he says, وَالْمُتَقَدِّمَةُ فِي الْمَطْرِ, as well as when you have some rain and there's the intention to bring forward one salah to the other salah. So let's say, for example, you have heavy rainfall during Dhuhr's prayer, and the Imam then decides to bring Asr's prayer forward and make jam' because of the rain. Then this is another requirement in which you need jama'ah salah, and therefore the Imam needs to have that intention. So most of these are pretty clear. Let's look at the notes, inshallah ta'ala, and see what reveals itself, bi'idhnillah. So we said the section deals with the intention of being an Imam and when it is compulsory. He says in footnote number 74, the intention of being an Imam is compulsory upon the Imam during the Takbiratul Ihram. So when must the intention be there? At the time of saying Allahu Akbar. As for the follower, the intention of being a follower is wajib if he intends to follow the Imam even in the middle of the Salah. Besides in these 4 conditions, in which case it is wajib for him to intend being a follower during Takbiratul Ihram. In other instances, if the follower comes and joins somebody, even in the middle of the prayer, they can just join at that point, and that's fine. But under normal circumstances, the intention needs to be present and prevalent at the time of saying Allahu Akbar to initiate the prayer. Then the 4 instances. Number 1 is the Friday congregational prayer, because it must be done in congregation. So footnote number 75, if the Imam leaves out the intention of being an Imam during the Takbiratul Ihram, his salah will not be valid. So if the Imam starts leading the Jumu'ah prayer and he says Allahu Akbar, and at that time his intention is that he's praying by himself, his prayer for Jumu'ah would not be valid. Why? Because Jumu'ah prayer requires a Jama'ah, and if the Imam makes the prayer's intention as being an individual Musalli, then of course that would not be valid. He then says to repeat the fard prayer. This is footnote number 76. To repeat the fard or nafil, the fard or voluntary prayer, in its time, hoping for reward. So what does this mean? To repeat the fard salah that was performed in its time, or a nafil voluntary prayer, which was sunnah to perform in jama'ah, except for witr salah in the month of Ramadan, because there's no repetition for witr, and to repeat them once, both on their time with jama'ah in the entire salah, hoping for the reward of jama'ah. So in this instance, a person prays, let's say for example, dhuhr prayer, and he prays this salah in jama'ah, and is hoping to get the reward by joining a second jama'ah for the prayer. Then again, in that case, because of the specific intention of the person, it is required for the imam in this instance as well to have the intention of being the imam. That's a bit of a rare case, and i'ada would generally take place if, let's say, a person prays dhuhr prayer, and he's completed and he's waiting for a group of people, for example, in the masjid, and then another jama'ah forms while he is waiting. So he thinks to himself, okay, I have some extra time, let's join the second prayer for the sake of reward or for the sake of jama'ah. Or perhaps he prayed the first prayer by himself alone, and then he sees a jama'ah forming, so he wants to get the reward of jama'ah. So in any instance where jama'ah is a requirement, so too will the intention of the imam as the imam be a requirement as well. The fourth example, or rather the third example given here, is a vowed prayer that is to be performed in congregation. So if somebody makes the nadhr, they make an oath to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, oh Allah, I vow to do X, Y, and Z, but in this case they pray, or rather they vow to pray a salah in jama'ah. So let's say they say, I vow to pray fard salah of dhuhr in jama'ah in a particular masjid, or whatever the case may be. Then because of the addition of in jama'ah, there again it would be necessary for the imam to have the intention of jama'ah. And then finally, a salah offered before its time due to rain. That's footnote number 78. You can also read number 77 here. If a person leaves out the intention of being an imam during takbiratul ihram, his salah alone is valid, but he will be sinful. Number 78. A group of people who are gathered because of rain, and they perform jama'ah or jam' taqdeem, wherein they bring the latest salah forward. Then if the imam left out the intention of being an imam, his salah will not be valid. So that's straightforward in the sense that if there is a requirement of jama'ah for the validity of the prayer, then the imam needs to have the intention of being an imam so that there is a valid jama'ah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Now we proceed to the next section bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and it reads as follows: Faslun fi shurutil qudwati, a chapter or a section regarding the conditions of following. Shurutul qudwati ahada ashara. There are 11 conditions for following an imam, and we will take them one step at a time bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Firstly, ألا يعلم بطلان صلاة إمامه بحدث أو غيره. The first condition is that there must not be knowledge of the invalidity of the prayer of the imam that they intend to follow, because they know or they've seen that the imam broke their wudu. They've witnessed that with their own senses. So if you know that the person who is leading the salah does not have a valid wudu because you've witnessed him breaking his wudu. Now this one is a bit tricky because one would have to assume certain things unless you have explicit evidence. So let's say the imam broke wind, or you somehow or the other you witnessed the imam relieving themselves, answering the call of nature, and you've been with them every moment since then and they did not renew their ablution. That would be an example of knowing that the imam broke the wudu. But more difficult circumstances would be where there's differences of opinion and you don't quite know which opinion the imam is following. So in the Shafi school, for example, if the imam was to hold the hand of his wife, then strictly according to the Shafi'i school, that would break the imam's wudu, but not according to the Hanafi school. And there are certain other examples of this as well. So again, it's a bit tricky, but for the most part, if somehow or the other there is knowledge that the Imam doesn't have wudu, then this would invalidate following that Imam. So he says, the ma'moom or the follower shouldn't know of any invalidity of the salah of his Imam due to ritual impurity or anything else. It should not be such that according to the madhab, okay, let's pause there before we go into the next point and look at footnote number 80. It is valid for a Shafi'i to follow an Imam of a different madhab whenever the follower is not certain that the Imam has omitted an obligatory component of salah. However, if certain that the Imam has omitted one, it is not valid to follow him. The validity is based solely on the madhab of the follower as to whether or not something obligatory has been omitted. Example, a Shafi'i followed a Hanafi Imam who touched his private part. According to the madhab of the follower, the wudu of the Imam is invalidated, but not in the madhab of the of the Imam. Now, herein you find the rajih or the mu'tamad view of the Shafi'i school, that in such a situation where the Imam and the follower practice different schools of thought, the strict rule of the Shafi'i school is that the validity of the prayer would be dependent on the follower's madhab and not the Imam's madhab. But for many Shafi'i contemporaries, especially considering that we live in mixed communities for the most part, everywhere in the minority world where Muslims are a minority, you find different madhahib coming together. So from what I've seen, most contemporary Shafi'i scholars would prefer the khilaf al-asah, meaning the non-mu'tamad view, and instead of promoting that you take the followers' madhab into consideration, they rather take the Imam's madhab into consideration so as to avoid issues of khilaf in communities. Because to judge the Imam's prayer based on one's own madhab is going to be problematic at many instances where, for example, the Imam is a Hanafi but the followers are Shafi'i, as in the examples that I made. So you see the Imam, for example, passing something to his wife and you've witnessed that he touched the hand of his wife. Then according to your madhab, the Imam's wudu is broken, but according to his madhab, his wudu is valid. So the mu'tamad view remains that the salah's validity is, the salah is invalidated because of the follower's madhab. But as I said, contemporary Shafi'i scholars and answers that you can find in Seeker's Guidance answer service would promote the non-mu'tamad view, which is to say you judge the salah on the validity of the Imam's madhab and not on the follower's madhab. So as long as he is in conformity with the rules of his own madhab, right, regardless of whether that's the Shafi'i madhab or the Hanafi madhab, etc., as long as he's in conformity with the rules of his own madhab, then the salah would be valid, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So that's an important point that we needed to reiterate there, bi'idhnillah. We move on to the next point, inshallah ta'ala. Number 2, it says, firstly in Arabic, وَأَلَّا يَعْتَقِدَ وُجُوبَ قَضَائِهَا عَلَيْهِ. There must be no certainty, there must be no belief that it is obligatory for the Imam to repeat the salah. It is obligatory for the Imam to make up the salah. It should not be such that according to the madhab of the ma'moom, now again that's the rajih view, but that's not the view that most contemporary Shafi'is practice upon or promote. The salah of the Imam is invalid and has to be repeated. Tamam? So that's the second point that ties into the first point. Number 3. وَأَلَّا يَكُونَ مَأْمُومًا. The Imam must not be a ma'moom, meaning the person that you follow as an Imam should not also be a follower of another Imam. Let's say, practically speaking, you get to Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara and you reach the outside of the Haram and somebody's standing there by themselves, for example, and you think, okay, I'll follow this person. But at that very moment, that person is in fact following the Imam that's inside the masjid. So you cannot take this person as your Imam if he has an Imam already, right? It's as simple as that. The Imam cannot be a ma'moom at the same time. So moving on from that was number 3. Number 4, wala ummiyan, right? The Imam should not be an illiterate person. The Imam should not be an illiterate person. This requires some contextualization. So number 3, 83 rather, a Qari who recites Quran properly may not follow one who is unable to recite the Fatiha correctly, irrespective of him being unable to recite other verses properly besides the Fatiha or not. So the main consideration is the recitation of the Fatiha, which is a requirement in the Shafi'i school for the validity of the prayer. And that is what is intended here by ummiyan. This is not a general term referring to all forms of illiteracy. The person cannot read, write other languages, or even read, write in Arabic. It's specifically referring to their literacy or ability to recite Surah Al-Fatiha correctly, and Allah knows best. We proceed to the next point, inshaAllah ta'ala. وَأَلَّا يَتَقَدَّمَ عَلَيْهِ فِي الْمَوْقِفِ. The follower should not precede the Imam in the position of standing. Right? The follower should not stand ahead of the Imam in terms of where they are positioned in the Salah. At minimum, right, the minimum extent of where the follower should be is that the heels of the follower needs to be behind the heels of the Imam. So even if the follower has longer feet than the Imam and the heels are behind the heels of the Imam, but their toes are in front of the Imam, that's fine. The main consideration is, for the very least, the heels of the follower needs to be behind the heels of the Imam. Now that's the mu'tamad view in the Shafi'i school, and that's the majority opinion as well. But what was interesting is, in my recent Umrah, we were living at a part of the Haram of Medina al-Munawwara, or in line with the part that was ahead of the Qibla. So when we reached the area where Salah usually starts, what they refer to as the Mataf, but it's not actually a Mataf, there's no Tawaf there, then people would be in front of the Imam. And many people wouldn't know or be oblivious to the fact that they are in front of the Imam, so they'd pray right there. So I thought of checking the mas'ala, and I found that there are other opinions, like in the Maliki school, certain of the Hanabila as well, who allow for the followers to be ahead of the Imam in cases of necessity, in cases where it's extremely difficult to ensure getting behind the Imam timeously, or there's huge crowds, etc. So in certain instances, like the Salah at the three Harams, etc., when the crowds can be really big, there are dispensations for that, though it is not the view of the Shafi'i school. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. We proceed, inshaAllah ta'ala. وَأَن يَعْلَمَ انْتِقَالَاتِ إِمَامِهِ. It is necessary for the follower, for the ma'moom, to be aware of the movements of the Imam. Let's look at the next footnote, number 85. It says, whether by seeing the Imam or hearing his muballigh, the person who repeats the Imam's takbir in a loud voice so people can hear. And of course, this would also mean speakers and microphones and the like. Anything that would give one an indication of the movements of the Imam. But if there's no such indication and the follower cannot know the movements of the Imam, then there's going to be a problem with the validity of the prayer, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We proceed to the next point, inshaAllah ta'ala. وَأَن يَجْتَمِعَا فِي مَسْجِدٍ أَوْ فِي 300 ذِرَاعٍ تَقْرِيبًا. The distance between the follower and the Imam, the requirement is that they must both be inside one masjid, or if they are not inside a masjid, then for the very least there needs to be no more than 300 ذراع, 300 arms lengths between them, taqriban, approximately. Now, as far as the approximation here is concerned, this is an approximation based on the concept of what is customarily near, what is customarily far. So scholars differ as to the exact distance that the follower can be behind the Imam. And there's a reason for the differences. There's no hard evidence as far as what the exact distance is, but based on what would customarily be known as far and near, and what would customarily be far enough or near enough to be able to hear somebody else or see somebody else. This is what was taken into consideration there. Another point here is that we refer to the follower not being behind the Imam directly, but being behind the last person or the last saf that is praying with the Imam. So let's say you have the Imam, then you have 3,000 sufuf behind the Imam, then a huge distance, and then the next saf. Then the huge distance part would be measured according to the the measurements given here in terms of whether it is valid or not, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We proceed inshallah ta'ala. وَأَن يَنْوِيَ الْقُدْوَةَ أَوِ الْجَمَاعَةَ. The ma'moom, the follower, intends to follow the imam or the congregation. Right? This is how the follower joins up with a jama'ah. He intends to follow the imam or the congregation. وَأَن يَتَوَافَقَ نَظْمُ صَلَاتِهِمَا. It is necessary that they are in sync as far as the order and the form of their prayer is concerned. So the follower's salah must conform to the prayer of his imam. If the imam is standing, the follower must stand, and so forth. The next point, وَأَلَّا يُخَالِفَهُ فِي سُنَّةٍ فَاحِشَةٍ al-mukhalafati. The ma'moom should not differ with the imam regarding those sunnahs which do not permit contradiction. The ma'moom, the follower, should not differ with his imam regarding those sunnahs which do not permit contradiction. So what comes to mind there? Let's look at footnote number 90. He says, if the imam omits a sunnah that the ma'moom cannot add without considerably lagging behind, such as the first tashahhud, then it is unlawful for the ma'moom to perform the missing sunnah. He must follow the imam. If he performs it anyway, intentionally, knowing that it is unlawful, it invalidates his salah. If the sunnah omitted by the imam can be done without much of a lag, such as jalsatul istiraha, then the ma'moom may add it without ceasing his participation in the jama'ah. This also applies to when the imam omits the kunut in subuh prayer, which the ma'moom may perform if he can catch up with the imam before the imam raises his head from the second sajda. If the imam raises his head before the ma'moom makes sajda even once, and he has not intended to cease his participation in the jama'ah, then the ma'moom's salah is invalid. So there's a practical example here that we can refer to, and that is one that was mentioned here. So essentially, sometimes the ma'moom is going to want to do a particular sunnah because it's part of the prayer, but for some reason or the other, the imam omits the sunnah. The first example is obviously a mistake, which is the omission of the first tashahhud. So the imam performs the first raka'ah, he performs the second raka'ah, he's supposed to sit for the first tashahhud, but he forgets and he stands up for the first tashahhud. Now the rule is that if he stood up for the first tashahhud, it is unlawful and would break his prayer if he goes back down to sit for the first tashahhud. But as for the follower, so the follower comes up from sajda and wants to sit for the first tashahhud, but then he sees the imam has risen. The follower cannot now say to himself, well, I'll sit for the first tashahhud because it is a sunnah, and then I'll catch up with the imam, because it will take too much time for him to actually catch up. However, if there's a shorter sunnah that the follower can catch up to without affecting his following of the imam, then he may do so. So the one example given is the jalsatul istiraha, which takes place after the first raka'ah and after the third raka'ah, which is you come up from sajda and you sit for a brief moment before coming up completely for the next raka'ah. If the imam omits that sunnah, the follower can do that sunnah and it would not impact his following of the prayer whatsoever because it's very short. But the more practical example of this, the one that we may have a question about, is the qunut. So once again, you go on Umrah, you go on Hajj, and the imams there, they generally follow the Hanbali school of thought. So there's no qunut in the Fajr prayer. Now for the Shafi'i, the qunut in the Fajr prayer is considered a ba'd. It is a sunnah mu'akkada. If you omit it, then it brings about the performance of a prostration of forgetfulness. So in this instance, the imam says, Sami Allahu liman hamida, and then Rabbana lakal hamd. Now is the time where the Shafi'i is supposed to do the qunut. If they were to do the qunut, they may lag behind the imam. Right? If they were to do the full qunut, as we usually do it, they may lag behind the imam, which is not appropriate. However, because the qunut isn't only the specified recommended supplication that we usually do, Allahumma hdini fi man hadayt wa afini fi man afayt, the qunut refers more to the making of dua in that particular position, which means you can actually fulfill the objective of qunut by praying any supplication even if it is, for example, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. That would be short enough for the follower to still pray the Qunut prayer and keep up with the form of following the Imam, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So that's an important point that we can take note of there when we need the information bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. We proceed inshaAllah. So that was وَأَلَّا يُخَالِفَهُ فِي سُنَّةٍ فَاحِشَةِ الْمُخَالَفَةِ وَأَن يُتَابِعَهُ. It is necessary for the ma'moom to follow his Imam. Now that may sound obvious, but if you look at the footnote number 91, it invalidates one's salah to say takbiratul ihram simultaneously with the Imam. So what we mean thereby with follow is that the actions of the follower should be after the actions of the Imam. It shouldn't be before the actions of the Imam, so he shouldn't precede the Imam, nor should he be at the same time as the Imam. He should not coincide with the Imam. Once the Imam does the action, the follower does the action immediately thereafter. So once again, it invalidates one's salah to say the takbiratul ihram simultaneously with the Imam, or to be uncertain as to whether one did so or not. It is makruh to perform some other part of the salah simultaneously with the Imam, thereby losing the merit of jama'ah, of congregation. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. We proceed insha'Allah ta'ala. The next section deals with the ways or the forms of following the Imam. So the ways or the forms of following the Imam. Faslun fi suwaril qudwati, the various forms of following. Suwarul qudwati tis'un. There are 9 forms of following. Tasihhu fi khamsin. 5 are valid. And وَتَبْطُلُ فِي أَرْبَعٍ. 4 are invalid. So let's begin with those which are valid. قُدْوَةِ رَجُلٍ بِرَجُلٍ. A man, meaning a man follower, following a male imam, that's valid. وَقُدْوَةِ امْرَأَةٍ بِرَجُلٍ. A female following a male imam, that's valid. وَقُدْوَةِ خُنْثَى بِرَجُلٍ. A khuntha, which is translated and understood generally as hermaphrodite, a person born with both male and female genitalia and their gender is unclear. It is valid for such a person to follow birajulin, a man. Tamam. Wa qudwati imra'atin bi khuntha. It's also valid for a woman to follow a khuntha, right? Also translated as hermaphrodite. Again, it is a very loaded term, requires more explanation and study. And it's something rare for somebody to have both genitalia and for their gender to be mixed, but the fuqaha have considered all circumstances. So it's valid kudwati imra'atin bi khuntha, for a woman to follow a hermaphrodite. Wa kudwati imra'atin bi imra'atin. It is also valid for a woman to follow a woman in prayer. Okay, this is the Shafi'i school. So a woman may follow another woman in prayer. Women can have their own jama'ah salah, and certain other scholars don't agree with that. They believe that when women pray, they don't pray in jama'ah, they pray individually. But for the Shafi'is, a women-only jama'ah is valid with a woman imam as well. Then, of course, that leaves the invalid ways of following behind. وَتَبْطُلُ فِي أَرْبَعٍ. Following in the following 4 circumstances are invalid. قُدْوَةِ رَجُلٍ بِامْرَأَةٍ. The following of a man, of a lady, meaning a man following a lady in prayer. وَقُدْوَةِ رَجُلٍ بِخُنْثَى. A man following a hermaphrodite. وَقُدْوَةِ خُنْثَى بِامْرَأَةٍ. A hermaphrodite following a woman, right? وَقُدْوَةِ خُنْثَى بِخُنْثَى. And a hermaphrodite following a hermaphrodite. Now, perhaps some contemporary application to this is the whole notion born in the last couple of decades, where women, on top of wanting equal rights in the modern world and in the world that they live in, the secular world, they sometimes also seek to have equal rights in Islam. So this is a loaded discussion, because now we are speaking about Islamic feminism, really. So when it comes to this topic, at the end of the day, the traditional Islamic approach is that the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are just, and as long as there's evidence sound evidence that the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are as we find them in fiqh, which of course we understand it to be the case, then those are the laws that would be applicable, especially in light of concepts within ibadat or law, or rather worship. Because Allah Azza wa Jal declares how we should pray, when we should pray, how we should worship in every different facet of our lives. And if there are differences in the worship of a male and a female, it's not culturally based, it's not based on circumstances, but it's based on textual evidence and divine revelation. It's based on instructions given to us in the Quran and in the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the rules are based upon that, then we follow that, believing that Allah Ta'ala's laws are just. So when Islam says that a male may not follow a female in prayer, then that is always going to be the case. And if that is a concept that is founded within the Quran and in the Sunnah, then it will always remain like that. There's no circumstance where we say, well, let's revise now to be more egalitarian and adjust the rules accordingly. No, when it comes to cultural matters, when it comes to everyday matters, and there's room to change, the way we interact and the way we live and the way we see the world, then fabiha wa na'imat, we can have those discussions and we can accommodate where Islam allows. But when it comes to the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we do not change and bend the laws of Allah to accommodate man-made perceptions of what justice and equality is. But instead, we believe that Allah Azza wa Jal is the ultimate source of justice and His laws are just, and we follow them accordingly. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. To conclude, I leave you with a question, inshaAllah ta'ala. The first that came to mind here was, can a person pray the obligatory prayer behind an imam praying a voluntary prayer? Now, this isn't something that is necessarily the focal point of this prayer, but it's something that comes up in practical daily application all the time. So if you are praying your dhuhr prayer, you enter a masjid and you're praying your dhuhr prayer, you intend to pray your dhuhr prayer, and then you see that there's people praying individually. So either you've missed the dhuhr prayer, or they are still praying the tahiyyat al-masjid or the 2 rak'at, 4 rak'at before the fard dhuhr prayer. Can a follower follow or attach himself to an imam who's praying a sunnah prayer while the follower intends to pray the fard prayer? Right? The information we've covered in the course so far should enable you to deal with this question bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And of course, there are more questions that you can also use to test your knowledge in the quiz that we submit or that you are supposed to take after each lesson bi'idhnillah. So do follow us on the forums there. If you're not registered for the course, then do visit us at seekersguidance.org and register for Essentials of Shafi'i Law, Imam Hadrami's Safinat al-Naja. What have we covered in this lesson? We have looked at the Imam's intention, we have looked at the conditions of following an Imam, and the forms of following the Imam, what is valid thereof. That's all for this lesson. Jazakumullah khairan. Until next time, inshaAllah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Subhanallahi wa bihamdi. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Nashadu an la ilaha illa anta. Nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
La ilaha illallah Muhammad